I am tasked with providing some background for what this project is about, what the context for our discussions today are, an overview of the New England milkshed, and a little introduction to different types of zones. Um, so let's start with answering the question of why are we here? So I'm sure you all have your own reasons for why you're here. And I want to set us up to have a shared understanding of where we're trying to go with this workshop. So the real simple answer to this question is that I've invited you all here to help tackle a problem. It's not a simple problem. It's a very difficult problem. It's a very complex problem. And it's even more difficult because we don't really have direct experience with it. And what is this problem? The problem that we're here to talk about is how we can protect the milkshed, the New England milkshed, from a highly contagious animal disease emergency. So there's a lot to that. And I would say this is not a problem that you want someone like me sitting behind a desk to try to solve on my own. This is the type of problem that is best addressed with input from as many stakeholders as you can get to weigh in on it so that you understand all the different perspectives that are, are at play. And when I use the word stakeholder, I'm talking about anyone who can be affected by the problem. So an animal disease emergency can affect a whole range of folks, from folks at the farm level, livestock producers, who may or may not be affected directly, but probably indirectly if we were dealing with an animal disease emergency anywhere. We've got the folks that work directly with producers, so private veterinarians, nutritionists, others who help supply the dairy industry. We've got folks in other associations, organizations, and institutions. We've got academic faculty, we've got extension folks, we have regulatory folks at the state and federal level. We have different types of regulatory folks, whether they're in dairy or animal health or environmental protection. All of these stakeholders will see the problem a little differently. They will bring their own perspectives to it. So that's why we want to have you all here. And we not only have different perspectives, we have different goals and objectives to what we are about, what our business is about, what our job is about. We all have different perspectives, different responses to uncertainty. When there's new things that happen or things that haven't happened yet, we have different ways of approaching that uncertainty. Not only that, we have different payoff structures informing our decision making. And what do I mean by that? I'm talking about the cost to benefit relationship of everything that we do, that informs everything that we do. So specific to an animal disease emergency, that could look like some stakeholders being paid to respond. It's part of their job. They're paid to respond. Whereas others, you could say, are paying as part of the disease emergency. They may be directly affected, their price they're getting may be affected, and they may be asked to do more in a situation where their time and their money is already limited. So we have to bring all of these perspectives, give all of these perspectives some consideration, because all of our actions and our reactions to others' actions will collectively then affect the result to individuals and to the region as a whole. So I think we're all here because we share an interest in fostering the resilience of the dairy industry. And it is so important for everyone here today to share your input and insights as we talk about this problem, as we put this challenge before you. Can we draw a line in the New England milkshed that we can secure and enforce? As I go through my introduction, I may call on a couple of you. So I know Paul is paying attention. He already saw the cows on the previous slide. Jess, I may call on you. Where we're heading next is to get a review of the threat that serves as the context for this project, give you an overview of the New England milkshed, and introduce several types of zoning. So get ready. We're going to travel the world, and I might get you to think of zone defense in a whole new way. Let's start with the context for this project. It's actually built on preparedness for foot and mouth disease. And some of you may wonder, why the heck am I worried about foot and mouth disease? And I think that's a legitimate question. We don't have foot and mouth disease in this country. We haven't had the disease in this country since 1929, not in Vermont since 1903. So why should we worry about it? There's other things to worry about. Well, I have a few reasons. One is it is an emergency disease, and we have, over the last few years, experienced a different emergency disease in the United States. That's bird flu caused by a specific type of H5N1, highly pathogenic avian influenza virus. And so we know that that can cause disruptions in livestock industries. What I want to show in this picture is that we shouldn't put outside of our concern a disease that we don't have direct experience with, as long as it exists somewhere in the world. So this map shows, with different color codes, where disease is and is not around the world. And this map is dated 2022. So if you look at the parts of the world where it's shaded dark red, so across the center of Africa, through the Middle East, through the Indian subcontinent, through part of Southeast Asia, those are parts of the world where foot and mouth disease can be found today, where it is regularly circulating, even when vaccination is practiced. Whereas other parts of the world, closer to the poles, the dark green areas, are where countries have been free of foot and mouth disease, sometimes for quite some time. So North America, Europe, Northern Asia, Australia, these are places that have been free. But things can change. And in fact, this map, being 3 years old, is out of date. And there should be a cross-hatched area in Europe, because earlier this year, there were some cases of foot and mouth disease in Europe, one in Germany and one in Hungary. So we can't, I don't think that we should ignore a disease threat as long as it exists somewhere. And another illustration of that really hits home is the experience that we're having with measles in the United States. So the United States has been free of measles for 25 years. Sometimes a case would be detected in people that have had traveled internationally to places where measles is circulating. But recently we've had measles circulating in a part of the country where the community was not vaccinated well enough to stop it. So these, I think, are a couple reasons why we need to be concerned about foot and mouth disease as a threat as long as it exists anywhere in the world. And if that doesn't convince you, I'll give you a few more reasons. So why is this disease of particular concern? You know, as I mentioned, we've had some experience with bird flu, and hopefully we've learned some lessons from that we can apply to today's discussion and maybe vice versa. But we've got with foot and mouth disease another highly contagious disease. It is among the most highly contagious animal diseases in the world. Like with many contagious diseases, it is likely to spread before it is detected. And this is a real problem, because that means where we know it is may not equal where it is, that it may have already spread, and it may take some time for it to progress in the newly infected animals to a point where it can be detected or seen as clinical signs. And if we wait too long to take protective actions, it may be too late. So it's really important to find it fast and stay ahead of it with protective measures. Foot and mouth disease is a little bit of an unusual virus in that it can affect multiple species. It affects most of our major livestock species, the cloven-hoofed species, so all of our beef cattle, dairy cattle, pigs, domestic and wild, small ruminants, so sheep and goats, and wildlife ungulates, so deer and all of their wildlife relatives with even toes. So if that's not bad enough, we have a disease that's problematic because its name is easily confused with a human disease, hand, foot, and mouth disease. So I can tell people over and over again that foot and mouth disease, the animal disease, is not a public health problem. It's not a food safety concern. But when somebody Googles it, guess what's going to come up? You can try it later and see what happens. So it is something that we need to keep in mind, that the general public and consumers may be very concerned about this disease if it were to happen. Now, why do I say it's a concern that it doesn't kill most infected animals? Well, that's because an infected animal, even if it's still alive, post-infection, a recovered animal, may not have as much value as it once did. And that's a problem. I also have on the concern side that a vaccine exists. Well, it's a concern because it's not a simple solution. I can refer you to webinars that explain the biology of vaccination, the challenges with vaccination, the US strategy for vaccination, which there is. But I don't want anyone to think just because a vaccine exists that will save us. Because the bottom line, and what really gets me concerned about foot and mouth disease, is that it would very likely trigger widespread economic consequences. And I want to dive into that a little deeper. Why would the economic consequences be so severe? Primarily, it's because our livestock industries are so productive and are producing products that are valued around the world. So this graphic is showing exports as a percent of domestic production from a couple of years ago. And you can see that the beef and dairy industries were exporting somewhere between 15 and 18% of the equivalent of their total domestic production. For the pork industry, even higher, almost 30% of what was produced went into international markets. All of that would come to a halt if one case of foot and mouth disease were found in any animal anywhere in the country. Just one cow, just one pig, just one sheep with foot and mouth disease would stop those international exports, because they depend on the agreements, the trade agreements depend on the US having a status of free from foot and mouth disease. Once that changes, all those agreements are out the window, and it could take time to restore them. Case in point, some of you may have heard of something known as an animal known as the cow that stole Christmas. So back in 2003, right before Christmas, a dairy cow was found infected with mad cow disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy. Guess what? That brought the export markets for beef to a screeching halt, and they went from record highs up to that point in 2003 to a record low the following year. And it took 8 years for the value of exports to return to the 2003 value. So the point of that story is, once export markets are lost, it may take time to restore them. It's not a quick and easy process. And I've also put on this slide, related to economic consequences, a concern about consumer perception. So even though foot and mouth disease is not a public health concern in terms of food safety or direct concern to human health, consumers may see it otherwise. And we don't really control what goes on in the mind of the consumer. We have messaging ready to go to support consumer confidence, but we can't be entirely sure what consumers would do. You with me so far? We're going to turn next to taking a look at how the New England milkshed works. And I want to start by grounding us in what a milkshed is. So it's a region from which milk is sourced. And I put as a graphic and an aerial view of the Lake Champlain Basin, the Lake Champlain watershed, which is familiar to many here on the meeting, with the drainage area, including geography in Vermont, Quebec, and New York. And so all of those regions are where the water is coming from that then goes into this major body of water. Some of you may be familiar with watershed-wide projects designed to reduce the chance of certain types of pollutants reaching major bodies of water. And if so, you may be familiar with the idea of how important it is to select exactly what type of control to implement for its efficiency and effectiveness, and where to focus on implementing those controls for best effect. Because at the end of the day, you can't do everything everywhere. And that's a concept I think we can take into our thinking today, that you can't do everything everywhere. So now we're going to look at the New England milkshed from a really high level, and there's a lot of numbers on here, and I'll walk you through them. I want to give you a sense of the patterns of milk movements. So less so the exact numbers. Take numbers with a grain of salt. These numbers actually date from a month period in January of 2010. But we've run these numbers by people more recently who are familiar with the industry, and they say the patterns are still true today. So think about patterns and not so much exact numbers. On the left side here, we have production in millions of pounds over a 1 month period. On the right side, processing volumes in millions of pounds. And looking at that top line, it's easy to see that processing volumes are much higher than production volumes by over 80 million pounds. Now, I recognize that 1 million pounds may be really hard to picture. So what I want you to do is picture in your mind an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Got that, on an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And that will hold, not quite, but I'm rounding here, it'll hold 6 million pounds, okay? So one Olympic-sized pool, 6 million pounds. What does that mean in reference to regional milk production? Vermont can fill 1.2 Olympic-sized pools every day. Every day, Vermont's cows are making enough milk to fill 1.2 pools, maybe a little more than that. And about half of that from Vermont is processed within the state, and the other half goes somewhere else. And we'll take a little look at that later. But if we look now at the numbers on the states here, representing the states of New England proper, some states have numbers that aren't too different between the left and the right. So Maine, processing about what it produces. New Hampshire, processing just a little more than what it produces. Rhode Island, pretty similar. But when you look at Vermont, the number is really different. So in Vermont, dairy farmers are producing way more milk than the state has capacity to process. Just the opposite in Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, the state's dairy industry is not producing anywhere close to the volumes that the state processing plants handle on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So where is that excess coming from? So we've got to look to the west of New England, our close neighbor, New York, and this is where the vast majority of milk that comes into the New England milkshed for processing comes from. Sometimes all of it is coming from New York. There are a few times when a load will come from further away, but most of the time milk coming into the region is coming from New York. And there's a little bit that comes into Vermont from Canada that's goat milk going to a processing plant in the state. But other than that, New York is the biggest contributor. And we'll take a little more detailed look at that later on. So we can't ignore the role that New York plays in supplying New England fluid and processing plants. And so these arrows are, the graphics here is representing kind of the basic pattern. So the states that have the circular circles are states where mostly processing is in balance with what's produced in the state. And then we've got the arrows representing major flows between states. but this is not all inclusive. There are other flows between states. They're just not represented here because they're typically smaller. If we want to protect the New England milkshed, what would be involved in preparing such a response? So there's several key activities, or there's a lot of activities that fit under three main headings in a response. So what is involved in preparing to respond? So I think about these three main categories of activities: prevention, detection, and response. If you visited the Healthy Farms, Healthy Agriculture website, you will see this in the footer: prevent, detect, respond. And I think these are really important concepts to remember. And I want to try to drive these into your mind by repeating them several times. Prevent, detect, respond. Can you repeat after me, right where you are? Prevent, detect, respond. Prevent, detect, respond. So what is this about? We want to keep it out. We want to find it fast, and we want to stop the spread. These activities would be going on in different geographies and a little different flavor depending on where disease is. So a lot of this could be happening around the area of known infection, okay? In those areas, the focus would be on containing and hopefully eliminating the disease. Other areas that aren't known to have disease would want to focus on protecting the health of animals in that area, preventing the disease from coming in, potentially proving freedom from disease. And that's where I want to focus our thinking today, is on that latter case where we don't have disease here. How are we going to keep it out? What if all we had to do was keep it out? But before we get into those discussions, I do want to give you a little bit of an idea of what happens in a control area around a known infected area. And I'm just going to show a minute of a video that was developed as part of a series of videos developed to answer questions about foreign animal disease response. And let me know if you're not hearing the audio.
During a foreign animal disease outbreak, animal health officials place farms or ranches with known infected animals under quarantine and establish control areas around them. The movement of susceptible animals is restricted inside these areas to try and stop the spread of disease. However, these restrictions also interfere with normal business operations. A control area includes the central infected zone and a surrounding buffer zone. Its borders are determined by officials and can vary based on the type of disease outbreak and the likelihood of spread. Usually, controlled areas are defined by landmarks such as county borders, highways, or rivers. Farm operators may need to get a permit to move any animals, semen, embryos, milk, manure, and other animal products inside a control area. To get a permit, they would need to prove that they are tracking the movement of animals and animal products, implementing biosecurity or disease control measures, and getting test results or inspecting animals for signs of disease.
So those last activities are things that would be happening no matter where disease was. There would be emphasis on traceability, biosecurity, and surveillance. And by surveillance, we're talking about information gathering to understand where disease is or is not. And that can be diagnostic testing, that can be clinical or observational, looking for clinical signs. So those are three important activities. And those would be happening regardless of where you are again, and in many different types of zones. And I'm just going to introduce a few types of zones. You don't need to know specifics of this, but I just want you to know that there are different types of zones. And what we're talking about today doesn't, I don't want our discussion to be limited to thinking about any particular type of zone. But we just saw illustrated a control area that includes two types of zones, an infected zone plus a buffer zone. If you put several of those together, you could have a containment zone. Outside of that would be hopefully a free zone. And there's another type of zone called a protection zone, which is another type of free area. And I'm going to take us on a tour to visit one of those that is in effect right now. So we have just traveled to the Caribbean. I don't know if any of you have traveled there recently, but now we're all there. So we are looking at the part of the Caribbean in the neighborhood of Puerto Rico. And right now there is a control area around the island of Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So these US territories are part of a protection zone that was established to help protect the US mainland from a disease called African swine fever that has been found right next door on the island of Hispaniola in the countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And by setting up a protection zone with a lot of inspection sites at boat landings and inspections before people are taking off from the airport, the goal is to prevent any infected or contaminated material from reaching Miami, which is only 1,000 miles away from Puerto Rico, okay? And as I think many people understand, there's a lot of reasons for travelers to go back and forth here. By establishing a protection zone around this area, if disease were to be found there, it could be contained there and not affect the status of the US mainland. So the US could still be maintained, could be considered a free country, but that required establishing the protection zone in advance. So there are some limitations on when a protection zone has value in keeping a free area free. But let's go to another part of the world and think about zones in a slightly different way. So now we've traveled to the Korean Peninsula, where I think many people are familiar with the demilitarized zone between North Korea and South Korea. But I want to draw our attention to the color-coded zones, which represent zones set up in South Korea for disease control purposes. And what these zones mean or entail is that movements of animals and movements related to animal production are limited to staying within the same color-coded zone. So movements are not going to cross into another area without meeting some kind of control. And the idea here is to isolate these networks. Some would call it decoupling networks or isolating the networks so that the production networks in each color-coded zone operate as their own network, which means if disease got into a zone, it would limit the potential for spread. It might spread within that network, but hopefully not spread into the neighboring network because we've limited the connections. We've established restrictions between those zones. So this may be a type of thinking we want to bring into our discussion today. So this is where I'm bringing in this concept of applying zone defense in a whole new way to protecting the New England milkshed. So what if we apply a zoning concept to New England, to the New England milkshed? Where would we draw a boundary? What kind of restrictions would we set up? What kind of biosecurity? If this zone were to be officially recognized in the sense of being up to the standards of the World Organization of Animal Health, which is the global animal health standards body, it would involve a description of not only biosecurity, but traceability and surveillance. We want to limit our discussions today to the biosecurity measure side of things. I will do a quick mention, though, of those other components and why I think we have a pretty good handle on them already. So we're not going to focus on them in our discussion. So traceability would include things such as animal identification. Most people are familiar with official animal ID and some of our requirements before moving animals across state lines. That's part of traceability. Surveillance, here we're talking about diagnostic testing. So we're familiar with this with the current bird flu outbreak that the USDA has started a national milk testing strategy. In Vermont, we're testing milk bulk tanks on a monthly basis, and that's surveillance. Okay, so we have some familiarity with surveillance. We have really good diagnostic labs in this country that are very competent in running tests, not only for our diseases that that we face every day, but they have capabilities for testing for diseases that we don't have every day, for foreign animal diseases that don't normally occur here, but we need to always keep an eye out for. So today we're going to focus on boundaries and biosecurity. And before orienting you to breakout groups, I'd like to open the floor to questions.
Go ahead, Paul.
Julie, this is Paul,
Hey, Paul.
and good presentation start, and a couple things that come to mind. It's not really questions here, but hopefully we can get some others in the conversation here. But one thing that is unique to New England versus, say, like Texas, is that we are dealing with many more state agencies within New England because we have so many states involved. Whereas Texas, we would have pretty much one agency, one state agency that we would be dealing with. So I think that's one of the challenges that New England will and does have, is bringing all these state agencies together to work towards one common problem, like you mentioned in the beginning. So that's a challenge. Another thought is in the beginning, Julie, you spoke of the different people, entities working with farmers. I'm thinking more of dairy, and one that wasn't mentioned that is huge in this process, and I'm kind of finding is reluctant to get on board, is the people that serve and move our animals. It's cattle dealers, it's beef, especially beef now, and we've got a lot of younger animals with dairy on beef that are going out and ending up in these yards where they're growing and finishing these animals, and they're all congregating in this area. So we got a lot of movement in that way, and still wondering if we're really on board with a uniform animal ID in respect to that. So just a couple comments.
Yeah, really good points, Paul. Thanks for bringing those up. On the point about having multiple states in a pretty small area and needing to work together, I do want to point out that the New England states on the animal health side do work together under the New England States Animal Agriculture Security Alliance. And that group does a lot of sharing of information and working together, and have assured us that they will do their best to work together in any kind of animal disease emergency, because they recognize the challenges that the industry would face if they had to deal with regulations in each state that were wildly different. Your second point is a really good point to make, and I was thinking along the lines of the fact that we have a lot of cull cattle from the New England region that go to Pennsylvania for slaughter channels, and that's an important flow of animals to keep in mind. And you brought up also the dairy on beef, really the beef cattle production that we have now that's been growing recently, and to think about what channels those animals are moving through.